It was a Tuesday night, which already felt like it should have been a no. I remember standing outside this bar downtown, neon light buzzing a little too loud for a weekday, pretending to read a text while everyone argued about staying for one more round. I didn't really want another drink. I was tired in that normal way where your body's fine but your brain is already halfway home. But leaving felt like breaking something, like I'd be disrupting the mood just by saying I was done. So I stayed, I ordered, I smiled. I told myself it was harmless. $12 for a beer, plus tip, plus whatever came after. I remember checking my bank app later that night, not panicked, just slightly annoyed and thinking, that added up faster than I expected. At the time, I didn't connect it to comfort. I thought I was just being social. But looking back, I think I was paying to not feel awkward. And that felt normal enough to ignore. Group dinners were always the same. Someone would suggest splitting the bill evenly, and everyone would nod like it was the most reasonable idea in the world. I'd look down at my plate, already mostly finished, and think about how I ordered something simple. No drinks, no extra sides. Meanwhile, someone else went full appetizer plus cocktails mode, and I'd still say nothing. It wasn't generosity exactly, it was speed. Even splits were fast, clean. Nobody had to pause the night to do math or have a tiny, uncomfortable conversation. So I paid more than my share and told myself it evened out over time. Except it didn't. If that extra $15 or $20 happened twice a week, that's over $100 a month. $1,200 a year. I didn't feel taken advantage of. I felt quietly responsible for keeping things smooth. And somehow that felt like my job. I used to take ride shares for distances I could have walked without breaking a sweat. A mile. Sometimes less. But walking felt like a statement. Waiting for the bus felt like an announcement. So I'd pull out my phone and tap for a car like it was nothing. $10. $15 if it was busy. I told myself it was about safety or time, even when it was 7:30 at night and I wasn't in a hurry to be anywhere. If I did that 3 times a week, that's roughly $40. Call it $160 a month. Close to $2,000 a year just to avoid being the guy who said, I'll walk. The part that's uncomfortable is how automatic it became. I didn't weigh the cost, I weighed the feeling, and the feeling of blending in always won faster than the idea of saving money. Upgrades were sneaky. Someone would mention better seats, a nicer hotel, a direct flight instead of the cheaper one with a layover. And suddenly the baseline shifted. I rarely wanted the upgrade on my own. I wanted the sameness, the sense that I wasn't opting out of the shared experience. So I'd click yes, swipe the card, and feel a brief hit of relief. Then later, a low-grade tension I couldn't quite place. That extra $200 on a trip doesn't scream at you. It just sits there. If I did that a couple times a year, suddenly I was spending a month's rent just to keep the group aligned. I remember telling myself, memories matter more than money, which sounds noble, but if I'm being honest, I wasn't buying memories. I was buying permission to not feel separate. And that felt harder to admit. Delivery was always framed as convenience, but it was really about consensus. Someone would say, let's just order in. And everyone else would agree instantly, like cooking was some outdated inconvenience we'd outgrown. I'd go along with it, even on nights I had groceries sitting at home. By the time you add the delivery fee, the service fee, the tip, and the inflated menu prices, a $20 meal quietly turns into $35. Do that twice a week, and you're looking at around $300 a month. $3,600 a year. That number still makes me pause. What's uncomfortable is that I notice the cost every time. I just chose not to sit with it. It was easier to pretend it was normal than to be the person who said, I'm good, I'll cook. Subscriptions were another quiet one. Streaming services, premium tiers, apps I barely opened. I kept them because conversations referenced shows everyone else was watching, or because friends shared accounts and it felt rude to drop off. $10 here, $15 there, nothing dramatic. Until you line them up and realize you're spending close to $100 a month on things you don't actively use. That's $1,200 a year just to stay loosely connected to shared routines. I remember scrolling through my statements and thinking, when did I sign up for all this? The uncomfortable part wasn't the money. It was realizing how long I'd been paying without really choosing to. I wasn't buying entertainment. I was buying relevance. And that felt like a strange thing to need. Group gifts were always presented like they were nothing. A birthday card passed around, a Slack message about chipping in, $20 here, $25 there. It never felt optional, but it also never felt forced. I'd Venmo without thinking, mostly because pausing felt worse than paying. Over a year, that stuff stacks quietly. Office birthdays, farewells, weddings, baby showers. I once added it up out of curiosity and realized I was spending around $600 a year on group gifts, not because I was especially generous, but because I didn't want to be the missing name on the list. What bothered me wasn't the giving. It was how automatic it had become. I never asked myself if I could afford it comfortably that month. I just assumed future me would deal with it. And future me always did. A little tighter, a little quieter about it. Weekend trips sounded fun when they were suggested. They always did. A cabin, a city getaway, something low-key. I'd feel the hesitation right away, but I'd ignore it because everyone else sounded excited. By the time lodging, gas, food, and random expenses were split, that cheap weekend easily turned into $600 or $700. Sometimes more. I'd put part of it on a credit card and tell myself I'd smooth it out later. The uncomfortable truth is, I rarely looked forward to those trips as much as I pretended to. I was anxious the whole time, mentally tracking spending while trying to seem relaxed. This is the part I didn't want to look at first. I wasn't paying for rest or adventure. I was paying to not be the person who said, I can't swing it right now. That silence had a price. Clothes were another subtle one. I'd buy something new for a specific event. Dinner, party, wedding. Because re-wearing something felt like showing up unprepared. The funny part is, most of those clothes barely saw daylight again. A $100 jacket worn once. Shoes that looked great in photos and then lived in the closet. When I finally thought about cost per wear, it was embarrassing. I wasn't building a wardrobe. I was buying short-term confidence. Over a few years, that added up to thousands of dollars spent on versions of myself I needed for one night. I told myself it was normal. Everyone does it. But the discomfort came from realizing how rarely I bought clothes for me. I bought them for rooms, for expectations, for moments I wanted to slide through without friction. I became the guy who covered small stuff. Parking, snacks, a round of coffee. It wasn't strategic, it was reflex. Paying felt faster than splitting, cleaner than asking. $10 here, $15 there. If I did that a couple times a week, that's easily $1,000 a year. Probably more. What's strange is I didn't feel generous when I did it. I felt relieved, like I'd avoided a tiny social speed bump. Being easy felt like a role I'd slipped into without noticing. And once you're in that role, it's hard to step out without feeling like you've changed. I never said, I'll get this because I wanted credit. I said it because I didn't want the pause. And somehow that pause always felt more expensive than the money. Work lunches were their own category. Everyone would head out, and bringing food from home felt like opting out of a shared break. So I went. $12 lunches, sometimes $15. 5 days a week if I wasn't paying attention. That's around $300 a month. $3,600 a year. Seeing that number written out made my stomach tighten. At the time, it never felt like a choice. It felt like routine, but routines are just choices we stop questioning. I remember sitting at my desk one afternoon, looking at my bank balance and wondering how I was spending so much without buying anything big. It wasn't reckless, it was familiar, and that made it harder to notice. Normal can be expensive when it repeats quietly. I avoided cheaper options around people without realizing it. Generic brands, discounts, deals, nothing dramatic. I just reached for the safer looking choice, the one that wouldn't invite commentary. The difference might have been $2 or $3 at a time. But that difference showed up everywhere: groceries, drinks, small purchases that felt invisible. If you overspend by just $5 a day, that's about $1,800 a year. I never felt flashy. I felt average. That's what made it tricky. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was just trying not to stand out. And somehow, that instinct guided more of my spending than I wanted to admit. It wasn't pride exactly. It was a quiet fear of being seen as less put together than I was pretending to be. Leaving early always felt harder than staying. At events, bars, shows. Saying one more was easier than explaining why I was done. But staying longer meant buying more. Another drink, late night food, a ride home instead of transit. Those endings were expensive. I noticed it especially on nights when I didn't even enjoy the extra time. I was just there, waiting for a moment that never really came. If that happened once a week, that's another couple $100 a month gone without much to show for it. I wasn't chasing fun. I was avoiding the mild discomfort of being the first to exit, and somehow that felt justified in the moment. Looking back, I realized how often I paid for hours I didn't want, just to avoid a sentence I didn't want to say. Shared vacations were death by small decisions. Upgraded rentals, better views, extra activities. Nobody made bad choices. They just made group choices. And group choices have momentum. By the time the trip ended, the total always shocked me a little. Not enough to panic, just enough to feel uneasy. I remember opening my credit card app after one trip and feeling that slow realization spread. I hadn't lost control. I just never stopped it. I went along with everything because opting out felt like pulling the brakes. And nobody wants to be that person. The discomfort wasn't about regret. It was about noticing how easily my limits dissolved in a group setting. They didn't get crossed. They just faded. Tech upgrades followed the same pattern: new phones, better plans, faster internet. Everyone else already had it, so staying behind felt like friction. The difference might have been $30 or $40 a month, which doesn't sound like much until you multiply it by years. I once realized I was paying almost $500 more per year than I needed to, just to stay aligned with what felt normal. I didn't even love the upgrades. I barely noticed them after the first week. What I noticed more was how quickly normal adjusted upward, and how rarely it ever adjusted back down. I didn't chase the newest thing. I chased the feeling of not lagging. That's a subtle distinction and an expensive one. Tipping more in group settings became instinct. Rounding up, adding extra. Not because the service was exceptional, but because I didn't want to look cheap. A few extra dollars each time doesn't register emotionally, but over a year it adds up. Maybe $500, maybe more. What made me uncomfortable wasn't the generosity. It was the motivation. I wasn't tipping based on what felt right. I was tipping based on how I imagined it looked. Image slipped into places I didn't expect, even into moments that were supposed to be about gratitude. I didn't notice it happening. I just noticed later how automatic it felt, and how automatic things rarely stay small. Hosting was its own performance. Drinks, food, extra snacks, making sure everything felt effortless for everyone else. I'd overspend to keep the mood light. $100 here, $200 there. Hosting a few times a year could easily hit $1,000. I remember feeling relieved when people said they had a good time, like the spending had done its job. But afterward, alone with the receipts, I felt oddly empty. I wasn't resentful, I was just tired. I never asked myself what level of hosting felt good for me. I only asked what would keep things smooth. And smoothness, I was learning, had a recurring cost. Some spending wasn't planned at all. It came from shared moods, celebrations, stressful weeks, bored weekends. When everyone felt something together, money moved faster. Drinks turned into food, food turned into plans, plans turned into expenses. I rarely traced those moments back to emotion at the time. I only noticed later when statements arrived. The numbers didn't feel random. They felt familiar, like echoes of nights I barely remembered. I didn't regret those moments exactly. I just realized how often emotion and money held hands when other people were involved. and how rarely I separated them in my head. The night I finally added everything up wasn't dramatic. I was alone, quiet, just scrolling through old statements out of curiosity. That's when it hit me. None of my spending looked irresponsible on its own, but together, it told a different story. Thousands of dollars spent not on things I loved, but on maintaining ease, on avoiding awkwardness, on staying aligned. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me quiet. I'd always thought being financially stuck meant doing something obviously wrong. This didn't feel wrong. It felt familiar, and that was harder to sit with. Now, sometimes I stay in, not as a statement, just because. The night feels quieter, a little awkward at first. There's a small tug, wondering what I'm missing. But there's also space. Fewer notifications. Fewer justifications. I don't feel enlightened. I don't feel fixed. I just feel aware in a way I wasn't before. Comfort didn't disappear. It just changed shape. And sometimes, when the room is quiet and nothing's pulling at my wallet, I notice how rare that used to be. And I wonder how much of my life I spent paying for noise I didn't really need.